Assalamualaikum students. I hope you all are well, safe and healthy at home. I'm your course instructor Farzana Khan. Welcome to all of you in this class of English language teaching. And I am here with the very important topic of English language teaching methods. So previously you were taught about grammar translation method, and in this class we are going to discuss about direct method of teaching English language. So by the end of this lecture, you will be able to understand the important concept related to direct method of teaching English language. You will be able to understand the techniques and characteristics of direct method. And finally, you will be able to apply the direct method techniques in your classes for teaching English language. So pay close attention to the lecture to understand all the important concepts one by one which we are going to discuss in this class. Because the grammar translation method emphasizes reading rather than the ability to communicate in a language. So there was a reaction to it in the 19th century, and there was later a greater emphasis on the teaching of spoken language. So as I already told you, that in grammar translation method, the focus is given on developing the reading and writing skills of the students by teaching grammatical rules, developing vocabulary, and focusing more on the translation, and in which the communication skills are totally ignored. So that was the reason that the people thought about it. So a reaction came after that the spoken should be given, focus should be given in developing the spoken language skills of the student. So as a result of this, the direct method of language teaching have been developed. So the slogan and the point, and you can say the principle of direct method of language teaching is basically teach the language, not about the language. No translation, no use of native language. These are the key points of direct method of language teaching. And direct method of language teaching is also called a natural method, because here the focus is given on developing the speaking skills. If the person is good at speaking, then he or she is considered as having competency in a particular language. And if a person can only read and write but cannot speak, then it cannot be considered that the person has the ability of language and is competent at particular language. So the direct method focuses particularly on developing the speaking skills of the candidates, of the learners. That's why this method is called the natural method. Along with this method is also called the phonetical method, because the focus is given on developing the pronunciation, the phones, sounds, and the accent of the students. And this method is also known as an anti-grammatical method, because here the purpose is not to develop the grammatical rules and the syntactic structure. Here the focus is given on developing the speaking skills of the students and learners. And this method is also called the reform method. Let little bit talk about the background of direct method of teaching. So in the mid and late 19th century, as I already told you, Europe experienced a wave of increasing opportunities of communication due to industrialization and international trade and travel. So the focus was given more on developing the communication skills. And at that time, the academicians and also the educators realized that direct method is not fulfilling the purpose for which purpose they have developed this method. So a need was felt to develop oral proficiency in foreign languages. So language teachers had already found grammar translation method inadequate and ineffective in developing communicative abilities in learners. So at that time they started to develop another method in which the focus should be given in developing the communication skills of the learners. So they strongly advocate an alternative method in which the communicative abilities of the learners should be developed. So language should be presented in context. They must be able to talk confidently in particular and in different contexts. So the Prendergast and the Xavier were the major persons who advocated the concept of natural method or direct method of teaching because they were against the grammar translation method. So it is this method that later on came to be known as the direct method, which is also called the natural method of teaching English language. So the question arises that what is specifically the direct method? I have already told you the principles of direct method. So let me tell you the definition or explanation of the direct method now. The direct method is named direct because meaning should be connected directly with the target language without translation into the native language. So the concept here is basically the target language, the language which is basically for which purpose students are here to develop and to learn. So the theoretical assumptions of this method are basically language can be learned only through demonstration. If the person is not going to practice, if the person is not going to speak in front of others, then he or she cannot develop the speaking skills. So instead of analytical procedures of explaining grammatical rules, students must be encouraged to use language naturally and spontaneously so that they induce grammar rather than cramming the rules of grammar and then translating into the mind from mother tongue into the second language and then uttering, because when you translate into your mind, then it takes time and it also affects the fluency. For gaining proper fluency, it's very important one should start thinking in the target language. So for this purpose, more and more demonstration and more practice is very important. The basic principle of direct method of teaching English language is basically the classroom. Instruction is conducted exclusively in the target language. The teacher should demonstrate, not explain or translate, because their focus is that the language should be taught in the target language. Whatever the rules, whatever the instructions teachers are giving in the classroom, they should explain and teach in the target language, not in the mother tongue, which is basically the strategy of grammar translation method. So all the instructions of the classroom will be given by the teacher in the target language. This is basically the point of view of direct method. So teacher should demonstrate, not explain or translate. Because in grammar translation method, the teacher were usually used to explain the grammatical rules in the native language, and then the focus is usually given to the translation. But here the basic principle is that the teacher should demonstrate. The way the teacher will teach and the teacher will speak and explain, the student will adopt that particular way, the pronunciation, the style, each and everything. So this is basically the one principle of direct method of teaching. And the second principle is that only everyday vocabulary and sentences are taught, because here the focus is given on developing the communicative skills, the spoken skills of the learners. So it's very important that everyday vocabulary and sentences must be taught to the students so that they must be able to communicate in the everyday life. So basic vocabulary is given in the first, and later on they can move towards the complex vocabulary which they require in the professional setting, etc. So vocabulary is taught through known words, demonstration, authentic objects and pictures, not through memorization and cramming, because in grammar translation method, the vocabulary is taught through translation, because the translation of particular words is provided to the students. Along with this, the list is provided to the students and they do cram and memorize the vocabulary. But here the vocabulary is taught through known words and through demonstration, through showing them pictures, and the understanding is increased by basic actual demonstration of those words, sentences and utterances. So the fourth principle of direct method of teaching is that grammar is taught inductively. It doesn't mean that they are ignoring the grammar. according to this method, grammar is also very important, but not to teach the rules of the grammar. So grammar is taught inductively. There may never be an explicit grammar rule given. According to them, it's not necessarily to teach students the rules of the grammar. They should be given the sentences. They will come up with the repetition. They will talk. They will use, and then they themselves will be able to understand the structure of the sentences. Do not give them rules. Make them figure out the rule themselves. So they are basically provided the text. So it's up to the student that due to the frequent use, they become able to understand how to construct the sentences properly. So the fifth principle, which is the basic principle of direct method of teaching, new teaching points are introduced orally. Because this method has been developed when there was the need to improve the communication skills of the people. So the basic focus here is given to developing the oral skills of the students, the basic speaking skills. For this purpose, it's very important, and this is one of the basic principles of this method, that new teaching points are introduced orally, not specifically into the written forms. Because the teacher will introduce orally, and the teacher wants from the students, they must demonstrate in front of the teacher orally. So oral transmission is one of the basic principles of this method. And the sixth principle is that both speech and listening comprehension are taught. As the focus is on developing the communicative abilities, that's why speaking and listening is the first priority in this method. After that, they focus on reading and writing. So speech and listening comprehension are taught, that how to listen and comprehend. Through the demonstration of the teacher, the students do listen and try to understand. At the same time, the teachers provide the text to the students, and they do communicate and demonstrate in front of the class, just to show and to develop and improve the oral skills. The seventh principle of direct method of teaching is that the teacher, by asking the student to make a choice, gets him to correct his own error. Here, basically, the students learn by making correction themselves. So learning by making correction themselves is also another principles of this method of teaching. The syllabus is based on situations or topics, because it depends on the level of the students. If they are able to speak everyday, they are able to communicate in everyday life, and they want to develop specifically the formal and most importantly academic and professional communication skills. So the course syllabus will be developed keeping in mind the requirements, the needs and necessities of the learners. So the syllabus is not structured already. It is basically based on the situations or topics. Contextual topical teaching is basically one of the principles of direct method of teaching. The ninth basic principle of direct method of teaching is pronunciation. For this principles, on the basis of this principle, this method is also called the phonetical method, because here the focus is given on improving the proper pronunciation of the students. So correct pronunciation is emphasized. For this purpose, it's very important that the teacher who is going to explain the rules in front of the teacher, who is basically presenting each and everything to the students. So it's very important the teacher must be good at pronunciation, because teacher is the demonstration. The students will learn through the demonstration of the teacher. So as the purpose of this method is basically to develop the communicative abilities, so when it comes to spoken language, at that time pronunciation is very important, because incorrect pronunciation basically gives a type of message to the person that you don't have competency in particular language. So correct pronunciation is emphasized here in this method. The 10th principle is that students should learn to think in the target language as soon as possible. This is also one of the important principles of this method, that students should start thinking in the target language, because grammar translation method focuses on translation, and due to teaching grammatical rules and focusing more on translation, it basically becomes the habit of the students to translate every text into the target language, and this basically hampers the fluency of the students. So it's very important to develop the habit of thinking in the target language. So they do start this practice from the very start of the instructions and teaching to the students. Well, the 11th principle of direct method is basically the purpose of language learning is communication. Therefore, students need to learn how to ask questions as well as answer them, because the first priority of this method is to improve the communicative ability. For this purpose, according to them, it's very important students must be able to ask questions and they must be able to give answer to those particular questions, keeping in mind the particular context. So communication is basically the first preference in this method. So these are basically the basic principles of direct method of teaching. And here the focus is given on developing the communicative abilities of the students. Let's talk about the techniques, that through which techniques basically they do develop the communicative abilities, pronunciation, accent, and accuracy of language of the students. The first technique is question-answer technique. The teacher asks questions of any nature and the students answer. Because the focus is given on developing the communicative abilities, for this purpose from the very start, it is the priority of this topic that to develop the communicative abilities, the spoken skills of the students. Along with this, the listening skills. For this purpose, the teacher asks the questions and the students basically give answers to the teacher. So dictation is also another technique which is used in this method. The teacher chooses a great appropriate passage and reads the text. So the teacher reads the text aloud and the teacher reads passage 3 times just to develop the accurate pronunciation and fluency of the students. And students are also asked to read the text. So here the focus is not given on the translation, but on basically the reading the text for the purpose of developing the speaking skills. And when they do listen to the teacher, so this practice also basically develops the listening skill of the students. The next technique is basically reading aloud. Students take turn reading sections of a passage, play, or dialogue out aloud, because when someone speaks loudly, at that time he becomes able to understand the pronunciation mistakes, the grammatical mistakes, and he becomes able to improve the fluency. So for this purpose, the reading aloud is encouraged more in this method. The next technique is map drawing. Students are given a map without label, then the students label it by using the directions the teacher gives. Here basically it improves the listening skills of the students, because they do listen the instructions of the teacher with full attention and they become able to understand the spoken of other person. And paragraph writing is not ignored here. The students are asked to write a passage in their own words. It basically develops the critical thinking skills of the students, and along with this, they become able to express their ideas in the written form. And different type of activities are given to the students for developing their spoken, or we can say the communicative skills. So this is basically the purpose of direct method of teaching because they want to develop the communicative skills of the students. Let's talk about the advantages of this particular method. One of its positive points is that it promises to teach the language and not about the language. Because when we talk about teaching any language, language is basically a language for which it's very important one must be able to speak, listen, read and write well. It doesn't mean one must have the knowledge of the origin of the language, about the rules of the language, and about the history of the language, because the purpose is specifically to develop the language skills. So one of its positive points is that it promises to teach the language and not about the language. So it is a natural method which teaches language in the same way the mother tongue is in the same way as the mother tongue is acquired. Because we do learn the native language or the mother tongue by listening to our elders, to our parents, and all other people with whom we do interact. And in the same way, according to this method, the language is taught to the students. So only the target language is used and the learning is contextualized. Because the teacher demonstrate and assign tasks to the students, and then students also demonstrate in front of the class. So its emphasis on speech made it more attractive for those who have needs of real communication in the target language. It is one of the first methods to introduce the teaching of vocabulary through realize. So these are basically the advantages of teaching through a direct method, which is basically the natural method in which the target language is used while explaining and describing all the points and while giving instructions to the students in the classroom. Because their slogan is that we do teach language, we are not here to teach about the language. But again, there is criticism against this method. In spite of its achievements, the direct method fell short from fulfilling the needs of educational systems. One of its major shortcomings is that it was hard for public schools to integrate it. So direct method didn't take well in the public schools where the constraints of budget, classroom size, time, and the teacher background, because the fluency of the teacher can hamper the way, because everyone cannot be the native speaker of the target language. So these were the problems, but along with this, there is basically the focus is given on developing the speaking and listening skill. And here the reading and writing skill, which are very important for academic and later on for professional life. So these 2 points are ignored here. So after a short popularity in the beginning of 20th century, it soon began to lose its appeal because of these constraints, and it then paved the way for the other method, which is basically called audiolingual method of teaching English language or teaching target language. So in next class, we will talk about the audiolingual method. So it's all about today's class. In this class, we have basically discussed about the direct method of teaching English language or the target language. And we have discussed the major characteristics, the principles of this method, and the techniques through which they do develop the language skills of the students. We also discussed the advantages of this method and the criticism which arise later on against this method. So the next topic will be audiolingual method, which we will discuss in the next class. So in case of any confusion, you can discuss with me in the WhatsApp group, and we can also discuss in the coming class too. So take care. Allah Hafiz.